So we have about 50 people, which is quite good. So we're going to start with a traditional open. So I want to welcome all of you, and I'll ask Dorothy together to open the meeting for us.
Fabulous. Now, Bosho, then Dognak, Nimki Kapaneshi Quendishna cause what we go do them. A skik mong donjaba. Miigwachka, keep a shy egg, imqueshka dad young ma, pine tree talks, shin dad. I'm going to sing a song first on my Dawe gun, and then after that, I'm going to say a prayer and then an acknowledgement to the territory. Haposho, Kishamanado, Nimki Kapaneshi Quendish Nakaz Wabagog Dodam. Chimigwach, Kishamanado, Ginsakosha Tuyan Gamishan. Chimigwach, Bishkakamekwe, Ginsakosha Tuyan Gamishan, Minawagam the Pamazion, now say when. Migwash the Namatam and say in a bit, Shanats Toyan in the bit. We don't question on Jackin when the bond in the bit, Panakam Dalgame. Chimigwach no missuck, mishomsuck, Kinoamat o de Wabanang, o de Shauna, o de Pingishmuk, o de Giwadnan, get the Germanem Ganat Moyak. Chimigwach Kishamnido, ga Quashka dad young ma, Saga, the big cock, Chimigwach Kishamnido, Hush womenish na Shamnido. Own and dead dog knock, then he walk, up to Gapana. Chimigwach Kajam the door, Minawagam in a Bamazian. Minapamazian, Migwach Kanoduyan, keep us in way on, Kinamayan, Migwach. So I'd like to welcome everybody this evening to the traditional territory of the Michisagig. Dad, Akink. This is the treaty territory of Treaty 20 and 23, and we welcome you, and we with open arms, because this land that we call home, the territory of the Mississauga Ojibwe, encompassing the communities of Curve Lake, Alderville, Hiawatha, Skugog First Nation, Rama First Nation, and Christian Island, Beausoleil First Nation. And together we live on this territory. And this land that we call Canada, or even the continent of North America, is large enough and mighty enough to share with all who came here and put their feet on the territory of the Turtle Island. So Chanie Wenjack for this beautiful talk that we're going to hear tonight, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to turn my camera off, etc. But I'll be listening, Cliff.
Thank you, Dorothy.
So thank you, Dorothy. I also want to acknowledge that this talk and the speaker is coming from Lenape-Hoking, the traditional territory of the Lenape, who have lived on what is now Manhattan Island for millennia. So welcome. I want to ask Elizabeth Russell, who's the director of the Trent Center for Aging and Society, to welcome everyone.
On behalf of the Trent Center for Aging and Society, I'm so proud to welcome you all to this event. This new partnership we're establishing with the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies is something that we at TCAS are very proud of, and we are so looking forward to next steps, including an event as early as next semester. This partnership will be equally characterized by seeking ways to communicate with older Indigenous people, with up-and-coming scholars, and with our community at large, focusing on learning about evidence-based ways that we may support, and in particular through research that intentionally aims to study the diverse and often overlooked needs of many is critical. From an intergenerational standpoint, supporting the next generation of aging scholars, including Cliff, and communicating their work back with our community is a really important role for TCAS, and one that we work towards daily and take very seriously. Thank you so much to Christine, David, and Amber for your hard work in planning this event, and especially welcome to Cliff. And thank you so much for your willingness to work with us at Trent remotely to pull off this event and to share your important knowledge. Really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, I'm the director of the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies. I'm David Neuhaus, and I also want to welcome you to this first collaborative effort between our two academic units. And I want to thank all of you for coming and taking the time to watch and to listen. I know there's a great deal of pressure on Cliff to do well tonight, and we know that he will do well tonight, as all Ph.D. students do as well. So I thought that what I wanted to do was to have Cliff introduced properly, and I reached out to his mother and father, who have agreed to say a few words of introduction to Cliff. I think they've known him for a very long time and know him much better than we do, and so I thought that I would invite them to say a few words. But before that, I just wanted to acknowledge and tell you that they are extremely generous people and extremely kind people as well. And I need to tell you a story about a meeting that I had 2 years ago with Linda. I was out looking for a Christmas tree, and I ran into her at one of the local garden centers. And I said, I'm looking for a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And they didn't have any for sale. And I looked everywhere and couldn't find one. And so I arrived home a couple hours later, and on my porch was a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And so Linda had gone into her field and dug it up and brought a Charlie Brown Christmas tree, roots and all. And it was the highlight of the Christmas 2 years ago. So thank you very much, Linda. That just shows you the generosity of both Linda and Tim as well. So thank you. And if you want to say a few words then about Cliff. You have to unmute yourself.
There. Are we unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. We have two sons, Clifford and Clayton, and they are both right now teaching. That makes us very proud, and we hope that you can learn as much from them tonight, or as much as from him tonight, as we've learned from him and his brother over the years. Cliff, as post-secondary education at Princeton University, Columbia University, and now New York University, where he's working on his PhD. So thank you very much for having him. And Cliff, good luck to you. And David, miigwech to you. I remember when you first came to Peterborough, and I don't know what year it was, but it was a while ago. And congratulations on the hard work you've done over the years. And thank you very much, miigwech, for having us and thinking of us so kindly.
Okay, so thank you, Tim. Thank you, Linda. So Linda, is Linda going to speak as well?
She can.
Oh, we love you, Cliff. I miss you. But anyway, other than that, thank you very much for inviting him. And we're very proud of Cliff and proud of the work he's doing, considering we're getting older too.
I'm looking forward to what he's going to say, because we may need it someday.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Cliff. I hope that gives you a good welcome back, okay, as well. So
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for that lovely introduction. I think you were too kind, but I appreciate it. And you know, David, I wasn't feeling any pressure really until you said that. So I'm feeling a lot of pressure. So let's go for it, too, guys. And I have to give a little shout out. I noticed a scholar joining the room who I actually cite in this presentation. I'm a big fan of. So Dr. Wendy Holco, so glad you could join us. And I hope you enjoy this work. So I'm going to be presenting today about Indigenous cognitive health. And this is really a topic that has been under investigated in the scholarship and in intervention strategies. And it's a whole field of research that has received scant attention by scholars historically, and limited resources from policymakers and from programmatic intervention. So I think this is a critical inequity that we need to try to address both through research and through intervention in the years to come. So I want to start off as well by just giving additional thanks to the Trent Center for Aging and Society and for the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies for co-sponsoring this event. I so appreciate the invitation. And I'm so happy to hear about all of the amazing initiatives coming together at Trent University to really integrate care for Indigenous older adults into the curriculum and into the programmatic development at Trent. So I'm really just excited to hear more and see more about the work coming out of Trent in the years to come. And I want to give particular thanks to David and Elizabeth for inviting me. So appreciate it. And of course to the faculty who support me at NYU, to my committee chaired by Dr. Ernest Gonzalez. So I want to start this presentation. You know, there's already been many things said about me, and I appreciate all of them, but I just want to give you all a sense of sort of my journey to this research. So I graduated college, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to work in a way that could support the lives of vulnerable children and families. And so I moved to Oakland and I started working for this agency called the Seneca Family of Agencies. I was there for about 3 years, and they really focus on providing intensive mental health and behavioral support services to kids who experience a wealth of intergenerational trauma and have severe behavioral needs. And here I learned so much about becoming a really critically thinking clinical interventionist and about the multi-generational effects of trauma and of poverty and exposure to systemic inequities, and how those inequities are then reproduced within the systems that children and families operate in, within schools, within welfare structures. All of these things reproduce those inequities over time. And I wanted to learn more about these systems that were contributing to these things. So I moved to Boston and I started working for this nonprofit called the Greenlight Fund, which was basically investing in these kinds of nonprofits and these interventions. And it was great. You know, I learned so much about how nonprofits function, about how people deliver services. But over time, you know, I just realized that I wanted to be closer to the work, closer to the change that was happening on the ground, and not spending so much time in an office building in Boston. So I said after 2 years of Greenlight, I was like, okay, I want to go back and get my master's in social work. So I want to become a really developed clinical social worker, and really be able to start designing programs and thinking about these issues in more nuanced ways. And while I was there, I got seduced by academia. Ada Mui, a gerontologist at Columbia, took me under her wing and really found that I had this deep interest in intergenerational interventions and thinking about how we can partner older adults with children to find really important positive outcomes for them in working together. And so in thinking about this, I moved to NYU to do my PhD with Dr. Ernest Gonzalez, a gerontologist who specializes in successful and productive aging. And over the years, we've also grown a focus on cognitive health. I would like to think in part thanks to my interests. But he's really been an amazing mentor and scholar at NYU. And my interest over time has changed so much in the program because I came in thinking I really wanted to focus on these intergenerational issues. And it became so clear to me that the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that got me out of the bed with research and with social work every day, was really organized around Indigenous health and Indigenous cognitive health. And I think there's a reason that this focus became so apparent for me. So I was lucky enough to grow up with all four of my grandparents in my life. Just Clifford and Eleanor Whetung. My paternal grandparents were having a little picnic lunch at Bald Lake, just about 15 minutes north of Curve Lake. At Grandpa's 91st birthday, his brother Murray Whetung is to the right of him, and my Uncle Mike in the background. He would probably feel annoyed that I included him in this image of older adults that I shared time with, but hopefully he can forgive me for that. And here is a photo of my mom with my maternal grandparents, Helen and Todd, in front of the Whetung Ojibwe Center, our family craft center. And so, you know, I was so lucky to be exposed to the wisdom and the generativity and the kindness of grandparents in my life. And one sort of unexpected benefit of that, I think really has driven my research interests in the last 4 years, was also the experience of watching them undergo the changes associated with cognitive pathologies. So in this photo here on the right, my grandfather Clifford and my grandmother Eleanor is actually in the later stages of dementia in this photo. And so this is a really degenerative pathology that affects so many families and really takes away personality and life and social engagement and all of these things. And so being able to participate in her caregiving and to see the way that she interacted with services and with caregivers over this time, I think has really motivated my interest in this field. And we saw similar things with my grandfather Todd when he was transferred into a long-term care facility. And across every system, it's difficult to be caregiving and to be living as a person who has dementias. Am I sharing the right screen? Can people see the slides? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't just talking. Are we good on the slides? All right, cool. Thank you, Jerry. I saw Jerry doing a thumbs up. And so I really became focused on figuring out, what are the critical issues around cognitive health among Indigenous populations, and how can we think about intervening in them in the future. So the growth of older adults in Indigenous communities is really a novel phenomenon in recent years. So some recent estimates suggest that we will have 2 to 4 times the total number of Indigenous older adults in the United States and Canada within the next 30 years. 30 to 40 years. We're looking at a more than doubling based on your sort of projection model from about 420,000 Indigenous older adults in the US and Canada to about 1.2 million by 2060. So we see this rapid increase in this population, right? And this reflects some changes in society as well. People have increased life expectancies as they are experiencing better access to medical care, better access to social services, changing medical technologies that help to drive life expectancy up. But for Indigenous populations, there's also something unique going on here, right? Because until relatively recently, particularly in the United States, Indigenous older adults lagged behind the life expectancy of the general population by almost 13 years. So until relatively recently, Indigenous older adults simply were not surviving long enough to begin manifesting the symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementias. And why is this the case? Well, there are a number of reasons that scholars have suggested, but I think it's pretty clear that systemic inequities and colonial forces over time have reinforced a number of systems that have reduced the life expectancy and increased the risk of mortality in Indigenous populations. And so part of why we are seeing an increase in the number of Indigenous older adults is because we are seeing some steps towards justice, I think, some steps towards equity and health and in service access. And so that's a really important thing to be thinking about as we're going through this presentation. I want to take a quick moment here to take a note on language. You know, not all Indigenous older adults are elders, and not all elders are older adults. And so I think there's still some negotiation of the language, at least as far as my learning in this. Dr. Halco, I cited one of your papers here. I hope that was okay. And I really want to be as inclusive as possible in the context of this research. So I'm focusing on the term Indigenous older adults. And for the context of this presentation, that's going to include First Nations older adults, Inuit older adults, Métis older adults, Native American and Alaska Native older adults. So those are the sort of 5 groups who I'll be including when I'm using that phrase here. And today I'm not going to be focusing on qualitative research, in part because it's not my specialty and we have much more skilled scholars in that domain, but in part because I think that the place that we found a real dearth of knowledge when it comes to the questions of Alzheimer's and dementias in Indigenous populations is in quantitative research. There's a large body of qualitative research, you know, much of it that has been conducted here in Canada that has looked at meaning making around cognitive decline for Indigenous older adults and their caregivers and community members and community perspectives on Indigenous cognitive decline. And they often find that, you know, dementia can be viewed as a natural part of the life cycle by many Indigenous peoples, and that Indigenous communities are rising to meet these challenges in novel and powerful ways. But today I want to look at the gap. I want to look at the area where I think we most critically need more scholarship and where we most critically need new types of intervention. So I want to start as well here by just like talking about what are Alzheimer's diseases and dementias, right? So what does normal aging look like? You know, there are age-related changes that every brain experiences over time. But the thing that differentiates these normal age-related changes in brain health from these diseases, Alzheimer's disease and dementias, is that they do not interfere with your everyday activities. You know, over time, your brain gets slightly smaller. We see changes in volume in different sections of the brain, particularly in hippocampal and frontal lobe volumes. We see some increase in microscopic deposits that maybe modify how our synapses fire. These things start to accumulate over time, this little wear and tear to the brain. And they're mostly going to be affecting processing speed, so the rate at which people can problem solve, and people's attention, right? These are the things that sort of change naturally as we age. But personality remains stable. Personality is unaffected by these things. Crystallized knowledge, the deep-seated knowledge, the long-term memories we build over time, these are unaffected by normal aging. That is not the case for Alzheimer's disease and dementias. Dementias are not normal parts of aging. These are pathologies, these are diseases. And they impact a number of different domains as they develop and progress in people. So you can see in this image here, the contrast between a healthy brain and one that has severe Alzheimer's disease. You can see that it's been modified significantly. The structure of it has been changed by the development of this disease. And, you know, in people who have ADRs, we might see reduced social inhibition, less ability to regulate emotions, some physical dysregulation. So Lewy body dementia sort of can manifest as with Parkinsonian-like symptoms. So it is a diverse set of diseases, and it can also appear in different ways. But these are progressive, these are non-reversible, and they are diseases. That's the thing I want. If you leave here with one thing today, I want you to leave with the clear knowledge that ADRDs are not normal. So the most prevalent of these diseases is, of course, Alzheimer's disease, you might guess. And the only perfect way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease is through autopsy, through actually looking at someone's brain and the lesions after they have died. And one of the reasons that it's important that we really think about these diseases, particularly in the context of Indigenous older adults, is that the cost of treating and managing Alzheimer's diseases and dementias is very, very high for both families and governments. The Alzheimer's Association estimates that the national cost of caregiving for those who have Alzheimer's disease in 2021 will exceed $600 billion, and that the average per person cost of treating these diseases will be in excess of $320,000. And one of the scariest parts of this is that the bulk of these costs are borne by families as well, right? So there is a huge burden on those who are facing socioeconomic inequity, poverty, who are struggling to mobilize resources for treatment of these things. These all are disproportionately affecting low-income people. And research into interventions, into the risk and protective factors for these things can help to decrease the costs of these things. And one of the things that we really need to think about is that Indigenous communities have historically been under-resourced when it comes to facilities, to programmatic interventions, and to educational resources that can help to treat things like Alzheimer's disease and dementias, so that these burdens are likely to be disproportionately borne by Indigenous communities. And I want to take a moment here as well to talk about the theory behind these things. Like why are we thinking about these diseases, and how do we think that these diseases can be changed over time? The bulk of cognitive health research to date has really been centered around two complementary models of brain development. These were created by Jakob Stern, who's a cognitive neuroscientist at Columbia. And these two models are called brain reserve and cognitive reserve. So brain reserve refers to the anatomic structure of the brain. This means that the size of our brains, the densities of neurons and synapses, and how they change are likely to be affected by cognitive diseases. So like the actual shape of your brain matters. If we have denser wiring in our brain, thinking about the synapses and those neurons, it may be more difficult for disease to impair its function. So you might be more resistant to these changes as a part of natural brain structure. But cognitive reserve describes how well our brain can cope with being damaged by disease or trauma. So there are a number of things we think that you can do to actually increase your cognitive reserve across the lifespan. So you can engage in really stimulating tasks like education, having a complex and novel job, having long-lasting and engaging social relationships. We can make our brain resilient by doing these things. And this means that people who have high levels of cognitive reserve show their pathologies, the symptoms of their pathologies later in life. And when they do show up, they tend to decline faster, right? So what we want is for people to be stable, to stay at a high level of cognitive function for a really long time, and then have it drop off precipitously. We don't want people to be in a slow period of gradual cognitive decline, where they're living with cognitive impairment for many, many years. That's something that we think can probably reduce people's quality of life overall. Another way to think about this is that brain reserve is a passive physiological factor, and it combines with the active factors of cognitive reserve to produce our brain's overall resilience to disease. I like this muscly brain that I found online. So this is sort of like the combination and interaction of these two phenomena can help to really define our resilience to dementias. Gil Livingston has done an incredible job gathering all of our knowledge about dementias and trying to produce some probabilities of variance around these diseases. So like, what are the things that really contribute to your risk of developing an ADRD? From their analysis, they found that about 65% of the risk of developing dementia is related primarily to genetic inheritance. So things we can't change. These are what we would call potentially non-modifiable. So what sort of APOE4 alleles do you have? What is your family history? What is your brain structure like? All of these things we can't change, right? But what this means is that about 35% of dementias are likely preventable. So we have about 35% of the odds of developing dementias we can intervene on, we can be preventative about. We can use interventions, and we can use education, and we can use research to help change. So some of the things that contribute to these potentially modifiable sources of dementia development: in the early life, education is a powerful protective effect. Low educational attainment is associated with increased odds of developing these diseases. In midlife, hearing loss is associated with increased risk of dementias. We think this is a mechanism primarily related to reduced social engagement. People talk to you less. People sort of might be more inclined to talk down to you if you have some sort of hearing impairment. Hypertension and obesity are also, as you might expect, associated with increased odds of dementias in later life. And in later life, things like smoking, depression, physical inactivity, being socially isolated, developing diabetes, these things also all increase our risk of developing dementias in later life. And these are all things we can change. We can intervene on all of these things through medical interventions, through social interventions. These are preventable and modifiable things that we can change. But I want you to ask yourself as you're looking at this list of items, it's like, what is missing from here, right? Like, what are the factors that these models of cognitive health have not thought about? What I would like to do now is take a look at some of the things that are associated with these models that we've shown before. So I want to start with talking about Indigenous socioeconomic status. So Indigenous peoples on both sides of the border have lagged behind the general population in multiple domains of mental, physical, and economic well-being. These systemic inequities were reinforced by cultural assimilation programs like state-sponsored religious and residential schools that work to dismantle Indigenous religions, languages, and cultural practices and replace them with European equivalents. After about 3 centuries of cultural and physical marginalization, inequities in health and socioeconomic status between Indigenous populations and whites have become stark and apparent. Relative to whites in both countries, Indigenous peoples have higher rates of all-cause mortality, of infant mortality, of diabetes, of coronary heart disease, of tobacco use, and lower educational attainment and life expectancy. This continues today. Indigenous older adults continue to report lower educational attainment, lower educational quality than whites, so having worse experiences in schools. They're also more likely to live in or near poverty. About 23% of Indigenous households across both countries live in or near poverty. And one study actually reported that about 40% of Indigenous older adults live at or near poverty. So Indigenous older adults, like many older adults, may be at particularly high risk of living in poverty in later life. There's also emerging evidence that Indigenous older adults report higher levels of perceived discrimination than whites, so that they are being systematically and discriminated against in everyday interactions. We also see inequities in health across a number of domains. So relative to whites in both countries, Indigenous peoples have higher rates of chronic health conditions like diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, cardiovascular diseases and smoking, heavy alcohol use when alcohol use is present, and depression. These factors have all been linked with increased risk of impaired cognitive function in later life. And these trends suggest that Indigenous older adults might experience high levels of chronic stress across the lifespan. These could yield something, higher levels of what we might call allostatic load. Allostatic load is a measure of how much stress we experience on the lifespan modifies our physical health. How does that stress get under our skin and change the physical structure of our bodies? But I want to ask you again, what is missing from these models, right? These are really talking about, people's diseases, about people's habits, people's behaviors, people's brain structures. But what they're not asking about is what's happening in the world around them that is influencing their experiences. So these are fundamentally individualistic models. By focusing on the behavioral and genetic contributions of the individual to cognitive health, we overlook the way that social systems and social interactions change those people for the better and for the worse. They also don't have the ability to identify mechanisms, right? To say like, this is the thing that might cause dementia in a clear way. So I want to propose to you a different model from Sarah Forrester at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. It's called the Minority Stress and Cognition Model. And this model, this theoretical orientation, was developed for use primarily with Black older adults to explain the experiences, the differential incidence of Alzheimer's and dementias in Black populations relative to whites. So Black populations in the United States are far more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's and dementias. And I think something similar might be happening with Indigenous older adults. So the minority stress and cognition model is a bridging theory. It tries to connect the individual to their society, to the world around them. And what it really focuses on is linking individual cognitive health outcomes to their experiences of discriminatory and systematic discrimination across the lifespan. So it suggests that race-based discrimination creates unique and harmful chronic stresses that reduce access to education, to socioeconomic opportunity, to high-quality jobs, by enforcing residential segregation, and that all of these things build up over time. That the accumulation of those stresses over time increases the risk of substance use. It increases the risk of unhealthy diets secondary to reduced access to quality foods, increases the risk of these chronic health conditions like diabetes and coronary health diseases that yield a higher allostatic load. And that all of these things build up over the lifespan to produce a higher risk of developing cognitive pathologies, of developing these dementias. Right? This is called the weathering process. So all of these million tiny cuts that you experience across your lifespan as a product of your race and ethnicity and discrimination connected to those things increases the chance that you will develop dementias over time. So the place we have to get to from here is like, what has been done so far? What do we know about Indigenous cognitive health? And again, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the quantitative research in this domain so far. So a big bulk of the studies that have been conducted so far really focus on incidence and prevalence estimates. So what this means is that they are trying to really get a good sense of exactly how many people for each race and ethnic group are manifesting dementias in different forms. Some recent systematic reviews and comprehensive literature reviews of research on dementias among Indigenous older adults I found a very small number of studies that include Indigenous samples. Between these two studies, they found about 16 unique studies that they included in their analyses. And they identified prevalence rates between about 0.5% and 28%. So there's huge variance in the estimates produced by these studies. This is to say that we don't have a great picture of exactly how many Indigenous older adults are developing dementias and what types of dementias they're developing. One of the other things that has become clear from these systematic reviews and from my own analyses of these incidence and prevalence studies is that there's a lot of variance in the quality of study being conducted with Indigenous older adults. In their analysis of these 15 studies, Warren et al. Found that 14 studies were at high risk for bias in multiple domains. And in addition, only 3 of the 15 studies used longitudinal data, which meant they were looking at the same people over time. Basically, everyone was looking at cross-sectional data, one person, one period of time. And this is really hard for us to identify trends if we're using data like that. This image is from a study conducted by Maeda et al. At the University of Washington. She produced an estimate of dementia incidence among American ethnic minority groups and found in her analysis, this was focused in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle and Washington, and found that the 2 highest probability groups of having dementias were Alaska Natives and Native Americans and African Americans. So there was a clear relationship here between ethnic minority status and the probability of manifesting these diseases in the sample. There's also emerging evidence that very high levels of perceived social support and connection among Indigenous older adults is present in a lot of these studies. And that might be providing some amount of protective effect, but we're going to come back to that a little bit later. In Canada, we see similar patterns. Jacqueline and Walker's 2012 analysis of administrative data from Alberta found that the estimated growth in dementias among Indigenous populations was about 420%. So they were estimating a 4-fold increase in the number of Indigenous older adults that had dementias by 2031. There's also been some pretty solid work done with risk and protective factors in Indigenous populations. So some things that have been identified in these analyses as modifiable risk factors for reducing the risk of developing dementias over time using Indigenous samples have been cardiovascular diseases, lower educational attainment, head injuries, hypertension, body mass index, socioeconomic status, unskilled jobs. So there are a number of different pathways that could be used for intervention, particularly with Indigenous older adults. And there's a growing body of evidence that is focused on this. But there are also a number of really troubling trends in Indigenous cognitive health research, particularly quantitative Indigenous cognitive health research. And the first one I want to talk about is blood quantum. So blood quantum is an odd phenomenon that was really focused on research in the Southwest for about the last 15, 20 years. It's fallen, it's less common now. But what blood quantum is an attempt to use one's parentage to produce a percentage estimate of how much of your blood is native, how much of your blood is indigenous. And the way that these studies often use blood quantum, this is also a metric used by some tribes in the United States to confer tribal status and band membership. The way that these have been used in studies historically is to try as a proxy for cultural membership. So rather than asking people, how culturally connected do you feel to your community? How embedded in your community of Indigenous older adults your Indigenous community do you feel? They're looking at what percentage of their blood they can identify as Native. And so there's this weird phenomenon that I think has deeply troubling implications and connections to eugenicist policies that have been implemented historically in the United States and in Canada. And so I think that one of the key areas of growth for quantitative researchers in years to come is to think about using cultural affinity measures that are less loaded and founded in less colonialist perspectives. In addition to that, I think it's clear that there's been inconsistency in the scale and the quality of research that includes Indigenous older adults. Part of this is a data problem. So there are very few nationally representative or longitudinal data sets that include a large number of Indigenous older adults. The Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging is probably the most promising counterpoint to this. In the coming years, we will have more data that gives us a better picture of Indigenous cognitive health over time, but that's still being collected. We still need a little more time for that to scale up. Most of this research has been conducted internationally. So there's a fairly large body of research that focuses on Aboriginal groups in Australia, some in Guam, some in the Philippines, a few in South America, particularly in Peru, but there's been really inconsistent application of this research in the United States and Canada. So we need scholars here in Canada and the United States to pick up this torch and focus on driving this point of scholarship to the forefront of our priorities. And there's also a clear lack of community partnerships in many of these studies. So there are a few small-scale studies that have partnered directly with tribes, but one of the challenges of Indigenous cognitive health research on a representative scale is that partnership with more nationally representative organizations is difficult because it doesn't really exist. Like tribal communities are diverse, they're geographically dispersed, and they have different sets of priorities. And so one of, I think, the challenges in the coming years for cognitive health researchers and for scholars who want to support Indigenous communities is to think about ways we can build stronger networks to collect high quality quantitative data in partnership with Indigenous communities. And one of the clear failures of this research has also been the focus on deficits, right? I've also done that today in presenting this research, is that we are focused on the things that are wrong with people in thinking about their Indigenous or in thinking about their cognitive health, the things that we feel like there are gaps on, instead of thinking about their strengths, instead of focusing on the incredible assets that many Indigenous communities have that might be powerfully protective against these diseases. I mentioned earlier the idea of informal support and social networks as providing potentially protective effects for Indigenous older adults. And several studies have identified shockingly high rates of feelings of perceived support from their communities in Indigenous older adults. And I think this is something we really need to be thinking about when we're doing our research, is how can we reorient our quantitative analyses to focus on the strengths and assets of communities instead of focusing on deficits. That's also a very social worky thing for me to be engaged in. So strengths-based perspectives are a core value in social work. So I would encourage you all to think more about social work in your work. I want to talk here a little bit about my research. So for my dissertation and for a few other studies, I used the Health and Retirement Study, which is a longitudinal data set. It's nationally representative of older adults in the United States. And it follows people every 2 years for their entire lives once they enter the study. So it's an amazing source of information. People who entered the study in 1992 were followed every 2 years until their death. This sample has been re-upped every 6 years, so it always stays about 20,000 people, really, really large set of data that follows the same people over time. And there is a very small group of Native American and Alaska Natives in this sample. So about 332 in total have been enrolled in the health and retirement study. And they have only been included in one analysis that I have ever found. So this has also been a historically under-investigated group of older adults. And so I just want to report a few of my preliminary findings from working with a smaller sample of this. This is from restricted health and retirement study data. These are not publicly available, and they really provide some novel information, I think, about this representative sample of Indigenous older adults. So for one, we see that although only a small portion of participants in the study identify as Indigenous, there are some clear disparities. So about 62% of the Indigenous older adults in this sample are identified primarily as female. They have low levels of education relative to all other racial and ethnic groups. About 70% of them have a high school or less degree of education, and they have low levels of income and assets relative to most other ethnic groups. And the differences between these groups are all statistically significant. We also find that they have really high levels of perceived discriminatory experiences. So while they have similar levels of major lifetime discrimination experiences, so a major lifetime discrimination experience would be like being denied a housing loan based on your race or ethnicity, or being denied access to healthcare because of your race or ethnicity. Everyday discrimination really tries to get at those million tiny cuts. Like, what are the little frequent pieces of discrimination you might feel as a product of your race or ethnicity or your gender or your age? And we find that Indigenous older adults report really, really high rates of everyday discriminations. So about 72% of Indigenous older adults in this sample reported perceived discriminatory experiences more than once a year. And 36% of them reported perceiving those experiences more than once a month. So these are very uncommon, very high levels of discriminatory stress. And this is the stress that we think can build up over time and contribute to the odds of increased cognitive pathology, thinking back to the minority stress and cognition model. These older adults also reported high rates of obesity, high rates of chronic heart conditions, and the second highest level of depressive index scores among any other racial and ethnic group in the sample. So we're already starting to see that there are some patterns here that might lead us to think that there are particular vulnerabilities in this group to the development of cognitive pathologies in later life. And so this next image shows what is called a naive cognition trajectory model. So this is measuring people's total cognitive scores. There's this measure in the health and retirement study called the telephone interview cognitive assessment. And what it does is it tries to get a sense of like exactly what is your total cognitive function in multiple domains. And this has been associated, low scores on this have been associated with diagnoses of dementias quite consistently over time. And if we look here, let me see if I can give myself a laser pointer. I don't know if I can give myself, oh, there we go, laser pointer. This yellow line here represents the cognitive health trajectories of Indigenous older adults. So what we see here is similar patterns of low overall slope relative to whites, who are this blue line up at the top, and a potentially high rate of decline as they get towards the later stages of life. So this model will change as I introduce things like education, allostatic load, these different measures of socioeconomic status, all of those things. That will change what this graph looks like. But I think what is important to see here is that these gaps that exist between Indigenous older adults and whites, between Black older adults and whites, and Latinx older adults and whites, these are not the product of some genetic difference, right? These are not the product of some fundamental biological difference. These are the products of systemic discrimination, of differential access to resources, of experiencing discriminatory stresses, all of these things that we think are associated with the minority stress and cognition model and with change of pathology over time. These social impacts on the physiological health of these older adults. I think that's what's going on here and what's acting on the acceleration of this decline that we see here. So more to come on this. This is the early stages of this project, but I wanted to share this with you because these models are hot off the Stata outputs. And that made my wife laugh in the background. And I also want to highlight one more thing before I leave you all today, and we can have some discussion. Is I think the future of this research is really going to be organized around cross-national collaboration in this field. You know, there's a growing need for partnership between Canadian and American scholars and between Canadian and American Indigenous groups. And I think that the reason for this is that we have there's so much shared history between these communities of historical, of cultural, and political oppression and challenge over time, that partnership across these national lines will really increase our ability to have an impact on policy, to have an impact on programmatic design, and to think really concretely about the future and how we can work to increase justice and increase equity for Indigenous older adults. So part of what I'm going to try to do in the years to come is to cross-map the Canadian longitudinal study on aging and this health and retirement study data. So we can have a large, robust sample of Indigenous older adults which we can then use to prove to policymakers, to prove to interventionists that there is a problem here, there is an inequity here that we need to address in the years to come. And so what do all the things I've said today mean for the future of research and the future of clinical intervention? Well, I think there's a clear ethical imperative for us to include Indigenous older adults at the table of cognitive health research, which they have historically been excluded from almost entirely. We really need to be thinking actively about how to partner with communities, how to increase participation in these research projects, and how to really make sure that the measurements we're using to collect cognitive health data have been attuned for use with Indigenous older adults. What is the cultural attunement of these measures that we're using, and are there biases inherent in them? This research has been done a little bit, but there's a lot more to do. We also need a lot more high quality quantitative research in this field. We're really just getting started on applying more modern statistical methods to these analyses. And it's something that we as a community of scholars and as advocates and activists need to think a lot about. Additionally, we need to have culturally attuned and culturally adaptive educational tools and assessment tools for use with Indigenous older adults, something we really need to be continuing to think about. But I think there's a lot of hope, right? There's a lot of organizations that are starting to do this in really great ways. So this is a photo of iCare. iCare is an organization that is based out of the University of Minnesota in Duluth. It has since sort of evolved into the Memory Keepers Discovery Team. And what they do is they partner with Indigenous communities, primarily right now in Manitoulin Island, to look at these assessments, to look at the ways that we're measuring cognitive health, and to think about the strategies being used by cognitive health researchers to try and increase the representation of Indigenous peoples in this work, and to make sure that this research is being done equitably and is being done with justice in mind and prioritized. And so there are a lot of great organizations like this that are thinking about developing education materials, developing interventions, developing assessments. So I think there's hope, and continued work with these places and with policymakers will produce change over time, I have to hope. And I'm going to end there. I want to make sure I have time for your questions, and I don't want to keep you too long on a Tuesday night with my ramblings about quantitative analyses. And so I just want to say thank you all to everyone, and I look forward to hearing questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Cliff. If you have questions, I invite you to present them in the chat if you'd like, or I think we can actually unmute people as well. If you want to raise your hand.
I see a question from Anne. Hi, Anne.
Anine, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Anine, I wonder if you have any data on the connection between one's Indigenous language and dementia.
Oh no, I really wish we did. And I think that there may actually be a measure in the Canadian longitudinal study on aging that asks about this, Anne. And so hopefully in the years to come, we will have a better sense of this. But one of the questions that they ask is about, what is your primary language spoken at home? What was your first language learned? And people can just type in what their first language was. So we might get a better sense there about the relationship between Indigenous language and the protective effects against dementias. But I think that's such a great question to bring up, right? Because one of the most effective tools of the residential school system has been the eradication of language, right? And the disruption of language transmission between generations. So we have to ask, like, will this change the cognitive health profiles of future generations? And how has it changed those who have been impacted by the horrors of residential schools? So really fascinating question.
Miigwech.
Well, Cliff, you dispelled all of the myths I grew up with about Indigenous aging, right? I grew up at Six Nations believing that Indigenous people did not get dementia, did not get Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the common myth that's out there. So you've dispelled that. So I guess the question now is, what do we do, I guess, as older adults, or the things that we can do based upon your understanding of these social economic factors now?
Look, I always say, David, number one is exercise. Exercise beats everything out in its preventative power for dementias. You know, there's some evidence that things like sleep are related as well. Getting a good night's sleep is really important, but exercise, 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 continued learning, continuing to stimulate your mind. These are powerful protective factors that we can all implement in our day-to-day lives. And, you know, I think you're right that, like, the historical myth, David, is that it was not present in Indigenous communities. And, you know, the reason that might be the case is because we have these massive gaps in mortality and in life expectancy, right? Like, maybe we just weren't surviving long enough, or those who were surviving were particularly resilient, right? They have a particular strength or particular luck. So there's all sorts of things that might have contributed to that myth historically, I think.
Now, this question is going to strike at the heart of the dean, but do you think that our current approach to retirement is a factor here? Because, you know, we tend to try to put older adults out to pasture and don't find ways to connect them to work.
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole question that's been posited by the productive aging and successful aging scholars, right? It's like, how do our policies around retirement influence the ways that we age in terms of physical health and in terms of cognitive health? And so I think that one thing to think about policy-wise as we go forward is, what are some mechanisms that we can design to help people remain in the workforce for longer if they want to, right? How do we make sure that we have protections in place that preserve people's right to choose to remain in work or to shift careers? You know, Japan has this fascinating second career program, which is a federal program. And what it's designed to do is to match older adults with a new career in later life, where they can learn new skills and work part-time, but like continue to stay engaged with across generations. Think about that generativity aspect of giving back, which is quite protective as well. And also just learn something new, right? So maybe there are ways we can implement policies like that in Canada, the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you give me a lot of ideas as we go into bargaining for a new collective agreement here.
Good ones, I hope.
Sorry, I'm dominated the questions here, so sorry, Liz.
That's okay, Cliff. There were very wonderful comments from so many people. I invite you to read later in the comments section. And one person, I think, summarized well what you just said. What's good for the heart is good for the head.
Oh yeah, Dr. Halco, always a great point.
I have a question though. One person asked, how does the data change with people living in reservations versus not?
That's a really fascinating question. So one of the challenges with our longitudinal data is that we don't really know very well where people are. There is some evidence that there might be higher rates of dementias on reservation versus off, but then there's also a little bit of evidence in the opposite direction as well. So I think that is sort of the next challenge with these representative data sets. We'll be doing some geo mapping as well to try to see where people are living when they're participating in these studies. Because one thing that is, I think, a group that is critically underrepresented in this research as well are groups of Indigenous peoples living off reservations, so the urban Indians, so to speak. And so I think that this is going to be a future direction for research that will really yield a lot of new knowledge for the field.
Wendy has her hand up.
Hi, Dr. Holco. It's an honor to see you.
Oh, this is fantastic that you're doing this work. It's so great to not only an Indigenous scholar, but you're also social work. And I like that, seeing that coming through. And bringing that critical lens and that Indigenous lens to quantitative data, right?
Yeah.
The power of doing quantitative research using stats to be able to influence change. I'm not familiar with the data set, so I have like similar questions to the last one that was asked, like what else you can, I was really interested to see the model, right? And to see that it's showing that sharp drop.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you're learning. Do you have the ability, do you know what kind of dementias, or are these just projections? Because we know from the literature that it seems to be, it's shifted, that it used to be in the past that it was more vascular dementia that was affecting Indigenous people, but then it's been shifting now to Alzheimer's, and it's been some of the studies in Australia, as well as Kristen Jacqueline and Jennifer Walker's, their research in Canada is showing younger and showing Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah.
And then the different gender as well, that it's more men, right? As opposed to in the general Canadian population, it's usually more women who are diagnosed as having Alzheimer's. Yeah,
you're right. You're right. There are so many sort of like, there's so many fascinating like intersectional relationships that might be happening here. And we do have the ability to answer many of those questions with this data. I think our conclusions that we can draw will be somewhat limited given the sample size involved, unfortunately. Okay. So with the Canadian data, I think we'll have a much better shot at really drilling down into those differences. But one thing I'm going to try to do in the next year is you can link this data with Medicare claims data. So with that, I can then actually determine what people's specific diagnoses will be. Okay. And so one of the plans with this is to get that data and then use the point of diagnosis, the point of disease manifestation, to modify the trajectories of these projections. So then we might see that, because I think one thing that could be happening here is that model is representing decline starting earlier and lasting for longer among a younger population, which is why it is accelerating so quickly. So it could be that what happens is that when that marker gets turned on for a particular diagnosis of dementia, we'll see that slope change quite dramatically. And so that's part of the plan in the long term. But the first goal would be to really focus on the relationship between allostatic load, this buildup of pervasive stress across the lifespan, and its effect on those trajectories. And I think once we have enough waves of the Canadian data, we'll be able to answer a lot more of those questions.
And the population, the sample is large enough?
It oversamples Indigenous older adults. So about, I think it's going to be 15% of the total sample is Indigenous. So it's going to be quite big. It'll be by far the biggest data set we have to date. So that's an exciting development, at least.
Yeah. One last thing, that if you're not familiar with his work, like Neil Henderson's work in terms of, but specifically around the Indigenous endemic model of dementia. Right. Because he draws very much on that allostatic load and historicizing it in terms of the impact of they're called boarding schools in the US, right? Boarding schools and Yeah, you're so right. I love his work. You're totally, I struggle with the balance of, writing for
these health grants, which, want us to de-emphasize the historical context, but like, how can we do that? I don't know how we can talk about Indigenous health and Indigenous cognitive health absent history. So I'm really trying to push that in. Yeah.
Well, and that's those of us who have done research with elders, that they say that it's trauma, right? That's what's causing it. And they point to residential schools. Like Kristen's found that in her research. We found that in research in BC. Yeah. And that's being increasingly recognized. It's interesting though, too, that the rates of diabetes were lower for Indigenous people than for Black and Latinx.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's usually people point to the diabetes and say that's the reason it's higher. I don't take much time.
Really fascinating.
I'm sure Nadine has an excellent question. If you don't know her work, you should look into her work.
Yeah, I need to.
And Sandy Grand. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Halco.
Yeah.
Can I go next, or?
I think you were next.
I don't want to speak out of turn. Cliff, thank you so much. Chanie Wenjack, I have a question. I am curious around successful aging and your research with Indigenous older adults, because I guess from where I'm located, I guess I'm pushing against successful aging.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm just curious how, I would just be curious if you would care to share any of your own experiences and thoughts around the tensions that you might be having.
Oh, I think you were so right to push against successful aging, right? Successful aging is really so organized around a specific model of productivity and of like contribution to society, right? And I think that fails to account for many ways that Indigenous older adults might be acting productively and contributing to their world. And this has been such a constant tension between productive and successful aging scholars over time as well. Dr. Gonzalez loves to tell me about that. But I think one thing I'm going to be trying to do with this analysis is to at least include measures, try to capture some aspect of volunteering, try to capture some aspect of work complexity when possible, which is possible by linking with ONET data, so using US Labor Bureau data to sort of give people a score for the complexity of their work. But I think it still will face the same critiques that you are hinting at here, which is that these models don't adequately account for the ways that Indigenous elders might be acting productively and successfully in their lives. And I don't know if there's a way in these data to get at that more nuanced component, but maybe with some creative coding and thinking it's possible.
Cliff, there's a question from the chat, and then I'll move to Jerry. So Chris Bergel asks, do we have longitudinal data among Indigenous populations to see how rates of dementia are changing over time? As in brackets, as perhaps some of the traditionally protective factors and behaviors, individual or collective, become less common?
Yeah, we don't really. We have in some regions, like in the Pacific Northwest, we have some longitudinal data which can get at these things. The claims data that Dr. Halco was referring to, that Kristen Jacqueline worked on, has some abilities to get at those things. And as far as like nationally representative samples, we really don't. The data I'm highlighting here, this 186 Indigenous older adults, is like the best we have right now, which has been shocking to me, right? This has been sort of like the constant tension of my PhD, is that like, I want to do this, but we don't quite know if it's possible with the information we have right now. So this is going to be like an emerging piece of information over the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think. And hopefully we can get a better sense of how specific protective factors are influencing the relationship between these outcomes. I suspect we'll see they act quite similarly to in other racial and ethnic minority groups, but I think that the real novelty of this research will be looking at these, trying to get at these things we haven't been able to investigate yet, that Nadine is hinting at and that Dr. Halco are hinting at, like these really less commonly attributed protective factors to cognitive health that might be more present in Indigenous populations than in the general population. So hopefully we can get there over time.
Thank you. Jerry.
First of all, this was amazing, Cliff, as usual. I'm a little biased because I know you, but
Thanks,
I
Jerry.
think I speak for everyone in saying this was a really amazing presentation. So my question is actually kind of twofold. I was wondering for you personally, like what you would want the implications of your research to be, and like what recommendations that you're kind of gearing towards or trying to move towards, as well as I know we kind of spoke about too, like the role of community and how important that is often as a resilience factor and a protective factor.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of thinking about too, like, what do you feel, or do you feel there is a space for community or even just community activism in terms of your research and what it is that you're trying to do?
Yeah, great questions as always, Jerry. I think like to your first question, I can see that you're still in the library, so really great scholarship going on over there as well. Jerry is also in my cohort of PhD candidates, so an amazing scholar who focuses on imposter syndrome in social workers of color and social work students of color. Really amazing work. But I really want to, I think that one sort of clear policy change that I hope this research can help to motivate is an increased distribution of resources to Indigenous communities for treating and educating about cognitive pathologies and cognitive health in later life. Because there has been a long history of, particularly with the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, of earmarking resources and earmarking funding for the development of these intervention strategies and these preventative care models and these long-term care facilities in Indigenous communities in the United States, and then not getting that money out the door. So Congress has just never greenlit that funding line. And so I really hope that with some increased attention being paid to these more representative samples and these highlighting the trends that are emerging in Indigenous cognitive health, that we can mobilize policymakers to make these changes. Because there's a little bit more evidence that the Canadian government is willing to move on these things, right? But the American government has shown almost no willingness to do so. It's a more optimistic political context right now, but I hope that's something that can come with time. And then as far as your question related to community components, I'm really interested in thinking about how I can make all of my work as accessible as possible, right? I'm so disenchanted with the idea of research that is extremely esoteric and uses language that creates barriers for access to community members. And we're never going to be able to intervene on most of these preventative domains of dementias as researchers and as programmers, right? Like as programmatic interventionists. This needs to be driven by communities, and it needs to be driven by community education, by community engagement in these things. And so I just want to think about like how I can best disseminate these findings to help communities really understand the ways that they can act proactively to protect their own cognitive health, and to come together as communities, build networks and build relationships that can be protective. And I think community partnership is the thing that will drive that. So wherever I end up next, I think that's going to be a big goal of mine. Chris.
Yeah, hi, Cliff. Thanks very much for the presentation. Really interesting and great discussion this evening as well. Your work to me makes me think conceptually of Chandler and Lalonde's work on the West Coast with regards to First Nations youth, mental health resilience and suicide, and starting to look at more innovative and culturally informed indicators, risk factors, but also protective factors as well. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you've got some ideas or even hypotheses of ones you'd really like to be able to explore that you think are more culturally appropriate and really perhaps more powerful in a predictive sense with regards to cultural protection against dementia onset.
That's a great question, Chris. And, you know, I wish I had an awesome, well thought out answer for you, but unfortunately I don't. You know, I think like one of the challenges of working in the sphere of longitudinal data a lot is that we become a little bit caught up in the fact that if we introduce a lot of new things to these long-running longitudinal data sets, we can't really compare so well against people who have participated in the past. So it's harder for us to track changes over time. But I think one clear change that we can make in addition to testing the cultural attunement of these validated cognitive health measures, is something Nadine was suggesting, which is like, how do we expand our inclusion of what productive activities are in these surveys? So do we ask about hunting practices, about community like volunteering practices, about engagement in council? Like, how are these things also reframed to be included within this productive aging framework, to be included in this productive work and productive protective framework of cognitive health? So I think those are some clear ones we can do. The challenge is then lobbying the survey administration organizations to make this happen. And thankfully, they're quite receptive to many of these ideas. So you've given me a lot to think about. That's something I'll have to be looking to in the years to come.
Great stuff. Thanks.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to read a question from the chat, Cliff. So Roberta asks if there is any research that focuses on Indigenous, non-Indigenous people who are neurodiverse and a possible link toward dementia.
That's a good question. I am not familiar with that literature if it exists. I think that I know that I have never come across that in the Indigenous cognitive health scholarship. And in thinking about these sort of meta-analyses that have been conducted, I've never seen an association between neurodiversity and dementias linked clearly. So that's a good question, but it's not something I know very much about.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I just want to thank everyone on behalf of the Trent Center for Aging and Society for the time you've taken this evening to listen. And Cliff, thank you so much as well for your wonderful presentation. And I'll turn it over to David.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. I also want to add my thanks to Cliff as well for an excellent presentation and for challenging us to think about a topic that is not generally thought about. I don't think that the Indigenous Mental Health Working Group that exists at the national level in Canada is thinking about these issues at all. At least I haven't seen them on their agendas as well. And I haven't seen any research from CIHR over the last 2 decades on Indigenous aging as well. So one of my goals is to try to begin to stimulate that research as well. So thank you. Before we finish, I just want to say there's one data set you might not be aware of, and that's the Urban Aboriginal Peoples Study in Canada. And it interviews 2,200 Indigenous adults. And one thing that we found in that study was that Indigenous civic levels of civic engagement by urban Indigenous adults was higher than the mainstream as well. And I think that's important because you talked a great deal about engagement and activity. And so I think that bodes well for the future. I'm looking for things that's going to prevent my own cognitive decline right here as well. So it's but I want to thank you. And you might want to take a look at that data set as well. And I can send you the link to it as well.
I'll take a look. Yeah, thank you, Dave.
It's publicly available as well. So
awesome.
Okay, so thank you. Okay, I'm really glad that we had an opportunity to learn from you tonight as well. And I hope there'll be more opportunities as well. We're planning the session in February, as you know, and so we'll be in touch about that as well around the Elders Conference. So thank you very much. And if I can ask then Dorothy to close for us, that would be great.
Right. Oh, so I sat through your whole presentation, Cliff, and I was really impressed by, just how you're able to, even with there's limited research studies that you could refer to as it applies to Indigenous and elders and on and off reserve, you're still able to find some specific subjects and issues that could help towards research, planning, programming in the future. Because as you know, among the Indigenous people of North America and the world, the elders are held in the highest regard. And if we could somehow help them in the ways of helping them have look forward to a happy, healthier way of life near the end of their days. Similar to this as the eagle feather. You know, at the beginning of life, this is everything. Our life is so almost carefree, and then the path to the western doorway kind of thins a little bit, and this is the time at the very tip is when we as Native elders and seniors want to enjoy this part. And there's lots to enjoy, still lots of life left to enjoy. So I'll just say a quick prayer here. Nahaposho kasham nado, nimki kapanashi kwandish nakas, wapagog dodam, chimiquach kasham nado, gachanandam sanongam the bikak, chimiquach, imquash gadad young ma up chigagachanandam, oh nindandaganak, hashwiminish nashem nado, wawena oh niniwakwawag, minga oh. Marjoning on Dion. The how me quach kasham the do canod we on. Keep us in we on. Kinda my on. The how me quach.
Hey, Dorothy.
Okay. Now, Dorothy, thank you very much. And
You're welcome.
And also thank you to Linda and Tim for being here and introducing their son. Thank you. Okay, and thanks, Cliff, for a job well done.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to put my email in chat because several people have asked for it. So if you want to email me anytime, feel free to do so. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I so appreciate it, and I appreciate all of your amazing questions.